Myself is Professor Anjila Gupta.
No.
Hello friends, myself is Professor Anjila Gupta from Indira Gandhi National Open University, and this is my pleasure to introduce you with Professor Arun Kumar, a learned economist, great thinker and researcher. He is Professor of Economics and Chairperson of the Department of Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And I'm really thankful to him for sparing his precious time to come over here and deliver a lecture on the topic Public Economics, the basic concepts which will be useful for the postgraduate students of Indira Gandhi National Open University to understand the fundamental concepts of public economics. And this will be also useful to understand the domain of public economics and its basic concepts like welfare foundation of policies and rationale of public intervention in terms of market failure and public choice making, etc. Now I would request to Professor Arun Kumar to please deliver his lecture. Professor Arun Kumar, please.
Thank you, Anjila ji, for introducing me to the students. Friends, public economics is now a very important topic because the role of government in society has become very crucial for every individual in society. The question is, how should we understand this? There are two ways that economic theory suggests an understanding of the role of government and of public economics. One is coming from the macroeconomics and the other coming from microeconomics. What today we are going to do is to understand it from the microeconomic aspects, and because of the time shortage I will only be able to give you a very brief synoptic view of this area. Let us look at the slide number 1, and you'll find that public finance or public economics studies and defines the role of government in an economy. I hope you are able to see the slides which perhaps are being projected to you. Now in this role, as opposed to the role in the developmental framework that is used in the macroeconomic sense, here you'll find that the idea is microeconomic based on the notion of the market, because microeconomics deals with essentially the idea of the market. Now, if the markets are working well, then the question is, why is there need for government? There should be no government if the markets are working well. And it is here that you will find that in large number of areas that there is market failure. And therefore, the core of the public economics coming from the microeconomic stream is market failure. So market failure is the core of the public economics that you are studying in this particular module. And here a very important concept is used, because when there is market failure, then some principle is required to understand it, and that principle is the idea of Pareto optimality. And I will come back to that question a little later. Now, if we see the next slide, then basically we have to have certain tools. What are the tools that we'll be using in this area of public economics? Very importantly, maximization is a theory from mathematics that is used in this area. The second very important concept that is used in public economics is the tool of general equilibrium, because everything in society and economics is interlinked to everything else. And general equilibrium is one area of economics which tries to look at the generality of all economics, how things are interlinked, what you are doing, how you are consuming, where you are earning, where production is taking place, everything, consumption, production, exchange, distribution, everything gets interlinked in the general equilibrium framework. And therefore, you use these two things together, general equilibrium and maximization as a technique. However, let me caution you while theoretically general equilibrium is fine, but in practical terms it is not very feasible because there are major data related problems. So in other words, general equilibrium theory, when we use it more in the theoretical sense than as if we can crank out numbers or churn out numbers, etc. Even though some people try to do that, but you can appreciate that in a society like India, where there are maybe 1 billion and 70 million individuals and each consuming thousands of goods which have to be produced, so you have millions of producers, you have billions of consumers, and you have large number of interactions amongst them. So a general equilibrium framework would involve billions and trillions of equations and variables, etc. So general equilibrium framework should be understood in a theoretical context, that it will enable us to understand the theoretical context. It is not that it will actually enable us to understand something regarding data, something regarding actual practices that will be there. So in that sense, it is very broadly indicative, and that's why this branch is called normative public finance. And that's why you must understand that it's not as if we'll be able to crank out some hard policy issues, but we'll only get indicative things that policymakers should attempt to do. Now, next, let us look at some underlying principle of this area. One of the key underlying principle is that of consumer sovereignty. What underlies this is that everybody as a consumer is sovereign. Whatever you prefer, whatever you want to do, only you should be able to decide that. Nobody should interfere with that. So you are in that sense sovereign. So consumer sovereignty is the underlying basis of this kind of public economics and the normative public finance theory. So government should do what? Government should respect, after all, what the market outcomes should be. So government should do that which the market should have done. For some reason the market is not able to do it, and as you know, in the field of general equilibrium there are certain rules that have to be fulfilled, and when those rules are fulfilled, then the economy is at its optimum. If those rules are not fulfilled, then the economy is not at the optimum, and we'll come back to this concept a little later. And then you find that the government has to imitate the market. In other words, what the market should have done, but for some reason it has not done so, then the government's role comes in, that it should do that which the market should have done. Okay. Now, it may not be always feasible, as we'll see a little later, but as far as feasible, the government should do what actually there has to be. However, just as a note of caution, the question is often between free market and a controlled market. When the government intervenes, it becomes as if there's a controlled market. And when the government is not intervening, then we say it's a free market. But this idea is not a very simple idea. And you must appreciate that there is really no situation of no government. That is, every market, every situation is one in which a government has to be there. If the government is not there, then the functioning of the market also is not feasible, because after all, government has to enforce contracts, has to enforce the rule of law, etc. And actually that is how you find the state has emerged in Europe. When it emerged many centuries back, it was because traders used to pass through various territories, and when they were passing through various territories, then the Robin Hoods and other brigands used to loot them. And when they would loot them, then the trade could not take place. So state emerged to actually protect trade. So in other words, set the rules by which trade could take place. So in other words, even when a market has to function, it has to function with the state, with the government actually enforcing rules and ensuring that these rules are followed properly. Okay. Now, what are the various kinds of market failures where government then has to intervene? And in the literature, there are many areas of market failure, and you will find that as societies have become more complex over time, market failure has increased. And that is why the government intervention in the economy has also increased. If you go back to 1870, for which some data was available, you find that the total extent of government intervention in the economy as measured as a percentage of the GDP used to be about 13% of GDP for all the OECD countries. And by 1990, this extent had increased to about 40% of GDP. So in other words, the state's intervention in the economy increased from 13% of GDP to 40% of GDP between 1870 and 1990. And this was a result of more and more complex societies in which the market failed in a wide variety of ways. Now, if you look at this slide, the very first concept that is there is that of the externality. What is an externality? Externality means that there's a third party effect. What is a third party effect? in an economy, everything is interlinked to everything else. So suppose you are using a pen. You could use a fountain pen or you could use a ball pen. If more people use ball pen, then the fountain pen industry will decline and the production of fountain pen would decline. So therefore, when you consume more of ball pen, then the fountain pen industry is affected. So this is a third party effect. However, in this third party effect that I was telling you, what is happening is the price of the pen would change, and that would be the signal by which one would be preferred over the other, and the production of one would increase and the production of the other would decrease. This is through the market mechanism. But in many cases, this third party effect does not take place through the market mechanism, and that is a case of externality. For instance, my driving a car in Delhi results in pollution, and you can do very little about it, and therefore the market fails because you are unable to affect this. So in many cases where the markets fail and the effect of one thing on something else does not go through the market mechanism, those are the cases where there's an externality. And externality can be positive or externality can be negative. What do I mean by that? When this kind of externality has a positive effect on somebody else, then it's called positive externality. And when the effect is negative, like in the case of pollution, then it's a negative externality. What are the examples of positive externality? Suppose you are living in a locality and you set up a beautiful garden, then everybody else in your neighborhood gets the benefit of that garden. So therefore there's a positive externality associated with the action that you have taken. Now therefore, externality is a case of market failure because the effects do not go through the market mechanism, and therefore markets cannot control this. And that's why we say that this is a case of market failure. The second kind of case that is looked at of market failure is that of public goods. Now, public goods are a case of joint consumption and where preferences are not revealed. Now, for instance, suppose you think of defense. Now, everybody has to pay for the defense, and jointly we all consume the defense. Whatever the level of defense provided in the country, it's jointly consumed by us. Suppose you think of law and order machinery in Delhi or any other city that you're living in, then all of us get the benefit of this extent of the police that is there in the particular city. Now, in these kind of cases, what happens is that suppose I do not want to pay for this service, then I can say, look, I am not particularly keen for this service, and therefore I don't want to pay for it. All right. So this is called case of preference non-revelation, because even though I want defense, but thinking that other people will pay for the defense, I say, no, I'm not particularly keen, so I don't reveal my full preferences, and I say, therefore I will not pay for this kind of thing. The famous example of this is of the country, which was a very well-off country, and therefore the king thought that let's have a pond of milk. So he got a big pit dug, and then he told everybody, the entire population of his country, that at night you come and you put 1 bucket of milk in the pit. Now the next morning when everybody woke up, they found there was only water. Why? Because everybody thought that I will put water while everybody else will put milk. And therefore what happened is the next day there's only water and there's no milk in the pit. So this is again preference non-revelation, because we are jointly consuming something and we can hide behind the preferences of others. So in this case also the market fails and we are not able to get optimality or efficiency in society the way it should be there. Then the next case that is very often discussed is that of increasing returns to scale, or what is the role of the public sector and of the subsidies that also comes in this increasing returns to scale. What is this case of increasing returns to scale? Increasing returns to scale means that initial setup costs are very high, like say in the case of railways, like say in the case of telecommunication, or in the case of say television stations, etc. The initial setup costs are very high, and then after that, for every unit of extra consumption, the costs are marginally. They're very, very low, and therefore the more consumption that takes place, the cost begins to fall. And that's why what happens is that as you produce more and more, you can produce at lower and lower and lower cost, and therefore in this kind of situation what happens is a natural monopoly forms. And when a natural monopoly forms, then they do not necessarily provide the optimum amount that should be provided. They act as a monopoly and they want monopoly profits, and therefore they curtail the output to that which will give them the maximum profit. They are profit maximizing firms. They don't necessarily want to optimize the social utility for the entire society. So therefore in these kind of cases what happens is that if production is left to the private sector, then because it becomes a natural monopoly, it will not produce at the optimum. It will produce at a much lower level than the optimum. In these cases, it is found that unless the government subsidizes the firm, it will not produce at what would be the optimum amount. So there are two choices. Either the government takes over the industry and therefore runs the industry on its own, like happens in the case of railways or in the case of power or in the case of, say, television and so on. It used to happen. Now, of course, there are private sector firms also operating in this, or in airlines, etc. But what the idea is that if the public sector operates, then it can take the losses, which can be subsidized out of the general finances of the government. But if the private sector is there, then it will only do monopoly pricing, and then society will not be running at an optimum level. The next case is that of merit want. What is case of merit want? Merit want is one in which the individual's valuation of some service and the social valuation of that service are completely different, and therefore the market is unable to allot the right amount of it. And education and health are prime examples of merit want. Okay. Now let me illustrate this as a small example. Suppose there's a girl child. Now, as far as the family is concerned, the family says the girl is going to get married and going to go away, and therefore why should I educate the girl very much, or why should I spend too much on the health of the girl? Now, as far as society is concerned, the girl child's education, the girl child's health is very, very crucial, because the next generation, the children, their health depends on the mother's health. Their education depends on the mother's education. So it has been found that if the girl child is educated and is healthy, then it has positive spin-off for the society. But the individual, the household, that feels that we are spending extra. So therefore there is a different valuation by the household or the individual, and a different valuation by the society. And that's why in this case, if the question of education and health is left open to the market mechanism, then you don't get the optimum amount of education or health. And that's why this is a case of market failure once again. Then the next case that is discussed in the market failure case is that of fiscal federalism. What is fiscal federalism? What happens in any society is there are layers and layers and layers of government. So in India, for instance, we have the central government, then we have the state government, then we have the local bodies. So there are many jurisdictions that cut across these different levels, and the local administration is unable to provide goods and services in an optimum way that the higher level authority can provide. So for instance, if you have many clusters of villages, then each will want the road to run in a direction that is best for them. But then you won't have a proper road which connects everybody. So you can have local roads, but when it comes to roads cutting across villages and cities, then you have to have state highways. And when you think of the nation, then you have to have national highways which will be chosen as per the national requirement. If you left it completely to the local bodies or to the state bodies, then you would neither have state highways nor would you have the national highways, because each one would orient it in a very different way. This is also seen the way when rivers are running through different jurisdictions, then how dikes have to be built so as to protect them. Now, when the dikes are built, then it might affect one village more adversely and the other village less. But on the whole, it will be optimum for everybody else. So therefore, a higher level authority is required to design the dikes so that it can give maximum protection to everybody, even if in the temporary period some villages or some areas would suffer more. This problem is also seen internationally, like in the river water dispute between, say, India and Bangladesh over the Farakka barrage or the Ganges, or between Nepal and India, because the water from Nepal comes down and floods India. Whereas if those dams were built in Nepal, then they could provide electricity, and also flooding could be avoided. But for this, some high level international authority has to be there which will intervene and which will get settlements done between India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, and other such things. So many such examples exist where fiscal federalism is very important, and left completely to the market, it would not generate optimality. So this is another case that we have to be very careful about. Now, next, if you think of it, markets cannot achieve equity. That's one very crucial thing that the markets cannot do. And again, for equity's sake, therefore, one has to have government. What happens is that in the market, there can be extreme inequity. You can have one person having all and the other person having nothing. Now, this kind of inequity is never tolerated in society. No matter how poor a society is or how rich a society is, some notion of equity always exists. And when there's a notion of equity, then the government comes in and provides that level of equity that society thinks is the right level of equity. But how is this to be done? How is equity to be achieved? For that purpose, the government is required under this normative public finance theory to do lump sum taxation. This lump sum taxation and transfer implies that the government will levy certain taxes and give certain subsidies to individuals, so that the outcome is that after trade has taken place between all the individuals, then society will be at the right level of equity that society itself wants. So this lump sum taxes and transfers are a crucial thing that are required to achieve equity in society. However, there really are no lump sum taxes which exist. Why? Because all the available taxes, like we are familiar with income tax, corporation tax, excise duties, customs duties, etc., these are all taxes which are not lump sum. They distort the market. They actually create problems in the market. And therefore, this is a hypothetical situation. And that's why you find that in reality, in the public economics literature, equity is only paid lip service to. There is really no prescription as to how to achieve equity in this kind of literature. But theoretically, it's only the government which can achieve equity. The markets cannot achieve equity. And this is another reason why you have to have the government to come in. Okay. Now, to achieve equity, in principle at least, what do you require? You require the social welfare function. The social welfare function incorporates in itself the entire notion of equity that every individual has. Now remember, in this theory, we have consumer sovereignty. So everybody has some idea of equity. So when we are building up a notion of equity for the entire society, then in that we have to actually bring in this idea of everybody's notion of equity. So therefore, Samuelson suggested an individualistic social welfare function. This social welfare function consists of the utility function of all the individuals in society, and that's why it's called individualistic social welfare function, because it's a social welfare function based on each individual's utility function. Okay, so social welfare function is a function of the utility function of each of the individuals. Now, such a social welfare function, actually what does it do? It gives a mapping of the social welfare states of society. So these mappings, and I will show you very shortly what these mappings will look like. If you focus on this, then you find that actually you have, suppose, two individuals in society, and we can generalize that to more individuals in society. So you have U1 here and U2 over here, and these are the social welfare rankings. And as you move up, you can see that the utility of each individual will move as you move up in this direction. Okay, so therefore the welfare rankings increase. Now these are the social welfare rankings that become very important, and therefore this has to be combined along with the concept of optimality that I talked about, the Pareto optimality concept. Here again you have the two individuals, U1 and U2. Okay, this is the Pareto optimal frontier. Why is this the Pareto optimal frontier? Because you cannot go beyond this. The shaded area is the area which technology will not allow you to go into. And therefore, it is very important to realize that you can be inside this frontier or at the frontier, but not outside the frontier. Because the given technology of the time, and how do we capture the technology of the time? We capture that through the production functions. Okay? So the production functions capture the technology, and they tell you how much output can be produced. So therefore, this Pareto optimal frontier is the one which society has to achieve to get to the optimum position, or what is called the efficient position of society. Now, this frontier, as I've been saying, using the word frontier, means that there is an infinity of points. From this point where 2 has everything and 1 has nothing, to this point where 1 has everything and 2 has nothing. These are the two extreme points where there is complete inequity in society, where 1 has everything and 2 has nothing. So therefore we are in a situation where any point on this frontier is a Pareto optimal frontier, because if you shift away on the frontier, then what happens? Then one becomes better off, the other becomes worse off, and that violates the Pareto optimality principle, because Pareto optimality principle says that you should not make one better off while making the other worse off. Okay, both have to improve. So if you move in this direction, then you see that both are improving. But if you move along the frontier, then one improves, the other deteriorates. So that's why this is a Pareto optimality frontier, and each point is a possible point. That's why it's called the Pareto optimal first best frontier. Now, therefore, you are in a situation where you want to achieve efficiency by being on this. But you are also in this position where you want to maximize the welfare of society. Therefore, when you combine the two together, this is what you get. You combine the two together, the green line represents the Pareto optimality frontier. This represents the highest social welfare ranking. So this point of tangency, where you have the tangency, this is what is called the bliss point. Why is it called the bliss point? Because this is where the social welfare ranking is the highest, and you are also on the Pareto optimal frontier. So therefore, this is the point that society has to try to achieve. Now, if there's market failure, what does it mean? You are at some point like this cross, where actually you are at a suboptimal position. So the role of government is to take the economy from here to this bliss point. So both you want to correct for the market failure as well as provide equity. So this movement from this suboptimal position to this cross here called the bliss point, this is the role of the government. This is why in the beginning I said government has to try to do that which the market would have done. The market should have brought the society to this Pareto optimal frontier, but because of the market failure you are inside. So role of government is now to take you from this point onto this particular point so that you can achieve both highest welfare ranking, that is equity, as well as Pareto optimality. So it is this that is very essential to achieve. Now, the next thing that is very important in this context is that we have two kinds of theories within this. What are these two kinds of theories? There is the first best theory and then there is the second best theory. What is the first best theory? First best is that it's a hypothetical situation, which is simply saying that all the things that are possible, that are positive, will happen. And that's why the first best is a hypothetical situation. But the second best is the more realistic situation. And it is in the second best situation that you find that it's a very difficult situation. Because second best is very, very hard to realize. And as we will see, second best results are very, very complicated, whereas the first best results are not so complicated. So in the first best theory that we have, the results are simple because this theory actually divides up so that each market can be looked at separately. And that is the meaning of saying ceteris paribus, that in the first best results are ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus means holding everything unchanged, you make only one change. That is ceteris paribus. So when only one of the market fails, then what is the government required to do? It only needs to intervene in that market. Now, if the results were not simple like this in a ceteris paribus case, then if one market failed, then government would find that all the markets are failing, therefore it would have to take over all the markets. And that is the situation that happens in second best, that if one market fails, then all the markets begin to fail. And therefore in the second best situation, which is the realistic situation, government has to take over all the markets. But in the first best, as I was saying, because we've simplified things, we made things very analytically simple. Therefore, when the market fails, government need only intervene in that market and not in everything else. So as I was giving you the example of, say, pollution. So in the first best model, when there's pollution, then there's an externality, and only that market where the pollution is being dealt with, only there is market failure. So government only needs to intervene there and needs to correct that. But it does not need to correct, say, the market for cars, does not have to correct the market for, say, bicycles, does not have to correct the market for, say, sweets. So all those markets will continue to function the way they should function, and Pareto optimality would be achieved for those markets. But as far as the market for environment is concerned, for pollution is concerned, that is the one it's failing. So what would the government do in this kind of a case? If you want to correct for externality like, say, pollution, then what you need to do is, you find that some people are polluting and that is having an adverse effect on other people who are suffering. Say children getting asthma because of air pollution, or because of various kinds of chemicals that are being secreted out of the cars in the exhaust. People are getting more cancer, people are having ill health, etc., etc. So some people are benefiting by the use of the car, and that's why they're using the car, and some people are losing out because their health is suffering. So what the government would do is tax those people who are using the car, so that they use less of the car and there's less of emission is there, and use that tax to provide benefit to those people who are suffering from it. So therefore it achieves a double purpose, that those who are creating the pollution are to be taxed, and those who are going to suffer, they are being provided some kind of a benefit out of the system. So you notice one other key feature of this first best policy, that is that how to tax and how to spend are a part of the policy itself. You don't require a separate policy for taxation and separate policy for expenditure as in some other theories you require. But in this kind of first best theory, you find that taxation theory and expenditure theory go hand in hand together. However, let me try and look at this a bit more carefully. Now, if the government is going to tax somebody, then it has to tax on the basis of how much pollution they are creating. And if it is to provide benefit, then it has to provide benefit to those people who are suffering on the basis of how much they are suffering. So in other words, the government needs to know a large number of marginal effects of how much pollution I am creating and how much ill health I am creating. So this requires huge amount of data. So that's why in most of these cases you find that there is really no simple policy prescription, apart from the fact tax those who are generating pollution and give subsidy to those who are going to suffer out of it. But then you find that this is not a very good prescription to achieve optimality, because you require to create exact amounts of marginal effects of both kinds and then bring them together. So there is a simplified theory that is also used when we talk about externality, and that is called the aggregate externality. In this kind of case, there is one tax, a Pigouvian tax, that is levied on everybody, and that when it becomes when it is given to the those who are suffering, then one subsidy is given to everybody. So in this kind of simplified picture, even though optimality is very difficult to achieve, but you find that at least one tax to lower the amount of pollution and one benefit or subsidy to people who are suffering will do. Otherwise the situation becomes very, very complex. So therefore, in this kind of a situation where in the first best analysis, you can actually take care of some of these situations, because only one market is suffering at a time, one market is affected at a time, and not the other markets. Now, in the second best analysis, what happens? As you see, in the first best analysis, this green line is the Pareto optimal first best frontier, but for that you require to have the right policy prescriptions. And if you don't have the right policy prescriptions, then what happens? Then you can never reach this point. All that you can do is you reach this black frontier. This black frontier then is called the second best analysis. So therefore, this second best analysis, this is the point you'll use by government intervention, but not the bliss point. So therefore, in the second best analysis, you are unable to reach the first best, the efficiency point. You are only going to be able to achieve something much lower than that. And that is what the practical situation is. And in the second best, a lot of welfare losses are associated. Because if you could achieve the bliss point, then the welfare is the highest. You have a situation where you have optimality and welfare. But if you are at a point like this, then the welfare obviously is lower than this red welfare line. So welfare here is lower, and therefore there are welfare losses that are associated with the second best. Now there's one other thing that is very interesting that comes up in the second best situation, and that is that there's no one prescription, unlike in the case of first best, where there's one unique bliss point, and all the time the government can try and target that bliss point because that's a unique bliss point. In the case of second best, there is no one unique second best frontier. Why? Because there are different kinds of market failures, and each different kind of market failure imposes its own limitations on the way the second best frontier is. There are different kinds of policy prescriptions that are required to correct for market failure, and those policies cannot be always achieved. And when they are not achieved, so therefore again you are on the second best frontier because you are unable to reach the first best frontier. So therefore the second best is not a unique frontier, unlike the first best frontier. And that's why there's no one common principle that can be adopted when we are in the second best. And that's why policy makers have a lot of problems as to how to tackle the second best policy frontier and how to try and achieve optimality. So there are only thumb rules that come out of the second best literature as to what should be done to try and achieve as much of an optimal position as possible by this. But please note that in the case of second best, again government intervention is required to even reach the second best frontier. So it's not that if you leave the markets free, they will automatically achieve some kind of a second best situation. If you leave the markets free, what would happen is that you'll be at an even more suboptimal point. This is the point where you actually began from. So therefore, free markets are not a prescription either in the first best literature or in the second best literature. Both require intervention by the state, intervention by the instrument of the state called the government, which then has to try and achieve optimality. So therefore, the second best, which is the more realistic situation, is a far more complex situation than the first best, which is really a hypothetical situation. And it is in the first best literature that the idea of free market is generated. But in the second best literature, there is really no idea regarding the second best that we have. Now, then how do we give an overview of this? If you look at it, this normative theory of public finance is only one kind of theory available, because within this also there are theories and theories and theories. It's not as if we have one unique result for everything. It's not as if in the first best and in the second best we can achieve whatever we like. Okay? So therefore, first thing to realize is that this kind of public economics is only one kind of public economics that is available. And especially when we think about it, in this public economics, what happens is that resources are given fixed. It is always thought that there will be full employment. Now this is opposed to the theory that we have in the macro public finance literature, where resources are not given fixed and you can generate more and more resources. And that's why you find that very often the results that you get out of normative public finance theory or the public economics theory are very different from the results that you get out of the macro public finance theory. Okay? So the reason is that in the macro public finance theory, the full circle of income flow and expenditure flow has to be taken into account. Whereas in the case of the normative public finance, in the case of public economics, what you find is that full circular flow of incomes and expenditures is not given its a full play. Then the second thing, as I was telling you, is that it deals with efficiency, but it does not deal with equity. And even when it comes to the question of efficiency, then also, as I said, you only have certain broad prescriptions. The reason is that the utility functions themselves are very hard to construct. And there is no unique utility function that you can construct. And then out of those utility function, you have to construct the social welfare function. So the utility function itself is somewhat ill-defined, and then the welfare function that one is using is also ill-defined. Now, further, what happens in this kind of theory is, this normative public finance and public economics, is that you have to maximize these. You have to maximize the social welfare. And this process of maximization, as you know, is coming from the field of mathematics, where we have to look at the first order derivatives and then look at the second order derivatives. The first order derivatives have to be equated to 0, right? That's how we do the optimization. And the second order derivatives, depending on whether it's maximization or minimization, we have to look at the sign of the second order derivative to find out what it is. Now, in this process of looking at the first order derivatives, looking at the second order derivatives, etc., we get certain very neat results. But as I said, the data that is required to actually implement those results is almost impossible to get. Like I told you, in the case of the externality, when we are discussing pollution, there you have to find out what the effect on each individual is of the pollution. And you know that pollution affects every individual differently. Like for instance, we have this example of cigarette smoking. Now, when people smoke cigarettes, some people don't get cancer, but some people get cancer very quickly. So all you can say is that when people smoke cigarettes, then they have a higher probability of getting cancer. But you can't say that everybody will get it. So you'll have in your neighborhood examples of people who smoke but who are quite healthy. And then you have examples of some who smoke very little and who are not doing very well. You also have examples of people who don't smoke and yet have a lot of lung problem, etc. So this health data that is required is very, very hard to get. So that's why right in the beginning I told you that data sometimes is almost impossible. And this kind of implementation of the first best and the second best theories becomes almost a kind of an impossibility. And that's why when we think of efficiency, because that is where you require huge amounts of data, you have to get the marginal effects, etc., that is almost impossible. So equity is something that we don't look at because equity is hard to achieve in this area, and efficiency is only indicative. So therefore the results have to be interpreted with a great deal of care. And when we say microeconomic theory, all this theory is based on microeconomic theory, then what are we saying? We are saying that we are looking at each market separately. I told you earlier that this first best theory is based on the ceteris paribus. That means we look at one market and its failure. And we believe in the first best that other markets are not affecting it. In the second best, even when the other markets may affect it, we try and minimize that effect. Because then taking care of all the effects becomes very, very complicated, and the results of the second best are very, very complicated. So therefore, in this kind of literature, what happens is that results tend to be microeconomic, looking at each market separately. Now this, as opposed to the macroeconomics, where you look at all the markets together. Okay, so that's why you find that the results of the microeconomic and the macroeconomic are very, very difficult. And it is with that note of caution that I would like to end this lecture, that when we are dealing with public economics, we need to ask ourselves what kind of indicative results we are getting. For instance, as I said, in the case of increasing returns to scale, when we are talking about the public sector, we are talking about subsidy, then it's only indicative as coming out of the increasing returns to scale that there is a need for public sector in all those industries where there are increasing returns to scale if we want to achieve efficiency. So in India, for instance, we've had a large share of the public sector precisely because we found that the markets would not be able to cater to the needs of the poor. So for instance, if hospitals get privatized, as is happening today in India, then what happens? The poor people who go to these private hospitals, they have to sell whatever little asset they have when the illness comes. And therefore, they become poor again. And those who need health and those whose health is poor, they are unable to afford it. And that's why health becomes a case of merit want. And it is here that we have indicative results out of microeconomics, out of normative public finance, out of public economics, that the case of health is one of market failure where we require to have state intervention, but it does not quite tell us what kind of state intervention will work or what kind of state intervention will not work, because there's a final thought I want to tell you, which is that state policies have failed and failed quite miserably in India. So for instance, there's a huge amount of corruption. What we tried to achieve with literacy, what we tried to achieve with health, we've not been able to achieve for the last 60 years also. So while in the micro literature you have the failure of the market, in the macro literature you have the failure of the state policies because of corruption, because of the various other aspects of the black economy that are very integral part of the economy. So if we want to understand our role of the government, which is what we are trying to do in the area of public economics, then we have to look from the micro point of view, the failure of the market. From the macro point of view, we have to bring in the failure of the government, the failure of policies, and so on. And when we combine the two together, it's only then that we'll find that we'll be able to understand this area of public economics. Thank you very much.